My name is Emily, and I've always been the kind of person who smiled easily, who shared jokes, photos, and little thoughts online with anyone who would read them. I thought I was connected, that I had friends, real friends, even if they were only behind screens and usernames. On my birthday this year, I woke up with a quiet hope that at least someone, anyone, would notice. I had 400 online friends, more than I'd ever imagined having when I first joined these social spaces years ago. I checked my notifications, my messages, my emails, hoping for a simple happy birthday, or a small emoji, a heart, a cake, something that felt like someone remembered me. At first, I laughed softly to myself thinking, well, maybe they're sleeping, maybe they'll come later. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the smell, the warmth in my hands, and the way the morning light spilled through my window onto the small desk where my laptop waited. I sat there, scrolling, checking the same messages again and again, each time hoping there would be something new, something different, something that made me feel remembered. But the messages were quiet. The notifications stayed the same. My heart felt a little heavier, but I told myself it was nothing, just a slow start to the day, nothing to worry about. I remembered how I had planned this day in my head, imagining waking up to laughter, cheerful notes, maybe even a video call from someone who cared, someone who knew me beyond my posts and pictures. I pictured smiling faces, voices that sounded warm and real, not just a username blinking on a screen. I had imagined this birthday to be small, quiet even, but meaningful, the kind of day that felt like a gentle hug from the world. Instead, I got silence. It crept into the room like the faint chill of a winter morning, settling around me softly but undeniably. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that birthdays were just numbers, that the warmth I wanted had to come from within, not from people who lived far away or didn't truly know me. But still, the thought kept coming back, whispering, "Are you really alone?" I kept telling myself no, that 400 friends couldn't possibly let a day like this pass without at least one kind word, one small message, one little sign that I mattered. And yet, as I scrolled through my feeds, seeing others celebrating their days with laughter, with hugs, with family and friends, the comparison cut softly at my heart. I started to feel the sting of invisibility, that quiet ache of being overlooked, of being someone's friend, only when it was convenient, only when they had the time, only when it suited them to remember. I put on a playlist, something soft, calm, with gentle piano notes, hoping it would fill the silence around me, hoping it would soothe the sharp edge of loneliness that was creeping along my chest. I thought about calling someone, anyone, maybe even a family member, but then I stopped. I realized that even if I did, it might feel forced, like I was asking for attention, for validation, and I didn't want that. I wanted it to come naturally, spontaneously, the way friendship and care were supposed to. And so I stayed quiet, sipping my coffee, staring out the window at the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze, feeling the emptiness wrap around me softly. I imagined the people who had liked my posts before, who had sent me messages on birthdays past, wondering where they were, if they had forgotten, if they even remembered at all. My heart was full of questions, and each one seemed heavier than the last. I tried to distract myself by tidying the little apartment I lived in, arranging the books, the small plants by the windowsill, the framed photos that held smiles frozen in time, moments that felt like yesterday but weren't. I thought about how carefully I had curated this life online, the friends I had made, the conversations I had cherished, the support I had given freely and without expectation. And yet in this quiet hour of my birthday morning, it all felt fragile, like it might vanish at any moment, leaving me with only myself and the echo of my own voice. I reminded myself that connections weren't always perfect, that sometimes life got busy, that people had their own worlds and struggles, and perhaps that was the reason no one had reached out yet. But even understanding that didn't soften the ache, didn't fill the empty corners of the day that were meant for celebration. I felt tears press lightly against my eyes, a quiet, gentle sorrow that I tried to push away, telling myself that I wasn't sad, that I was okay. Yet the silence was loud, and the absence of words from 400 people was deafening in its own way. I thought about all the times I had celebrated others' birthdays, sending messages, gifts, little gestures of kindness, always hoping that my attention mattered, that it would be returned when the day came for me. And now, when my turn came, the absence of even one person reaching out made the previous efforts feel invisible, like small ripples lost in a vast, unfeeling ocean. I went through my day slowly, mechanically, preparing breakfast, sitting with my coffee, staring at the blank screens that promised connection but gave me none. Each ping of a notification made my heart leap, only to sink again in disappointment. I realized in that quiet, reflective moment that I had built a world of friends who existed online, but I had never fully built a world of friends who existed around me, in the real, tangible spaces of life. And so, as the hours passed, I began to feel a soft, creeping realization that perhaps this birthday would be different, not because of what others would do, but because of what I had to face within myself. I had to face the truth that connection is more than a number, more than likes, more than follows, and more than friendly emojis. Connection is warmth, presence, care, and shared moments that live beyond the screen. And in their absence, even the hundreds of people who had wished me happy birthday in previous years could not fill the empty room I sat in now. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, feeling its warmth seep into my hands and chest, trying to soothe the hollowness that had settled in quietly but firmly. I picked up my phone, scrolling one last time through messages, and realized that each absence was a story in itself, a story of people busy with their own lives, of schedules and distractions, of genuine forgetfulness or casual neglect, and yet the pain of it was mine to feel, raw and unfiltered, because it mattered to me, because I had hoped. I put the phone down and looked around the apartment, at the small comforts I had made for myself. A candle flickering gently on the table, a blanket folded neatly on the couch, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. I realized that while no one had reached out, while the 400 friends remained silent, the day had not ended, the world had not stopped, and the quiet moments, even in loneliness, held their own gentle beauty. I thought about how I could spend the day, not waiting for messages that might never come, but filling it with small acts of care for myself. Listening to music I loved, reading a book I loved, writing a note to myself about the life I wanted to build, the connections I wanted to nurture, not online, but in real, tangible ways. And as I sat there, the sun slowly climbing higher, I felt a quiet resolve forming inside me, soft but undeniable. Today would be spent alone, yes, but it could still be a day of reflection, of gentle self-compassion, of small celebrations of the life I had built for myself, even if no one else noticed. I could make this day about me, about the small joys that didn't require anyone else's presence or validation. And so with a deep breath, I lifted my mug, feeling its warmth, and whispered quietly to myself, "Happy birthday, Emily. You are here, you are alive, and that is enough for today." The words sounded small, almost fragile in the vast quiet of the apartment, but they were mine, and for the first time that morning, I felt a tiny, flickering sense of peace. I sat with it, letting it settle in me, knowing that the day would unfold slowly, that moments of joy could be found even in solitude, and that the connections I had online, though not absent now, could not erase the reality that I was still here, still present, still capable of feeling, still capable of hope. And yet beneath that fragile peace, there remained a shadow of longing, a soft ache that reminded me that humans, even those with hundreds of digital friends, craved the warmth of real presence. I wondered quietly if the silence was a reflection of who I was to them, or simply the randomness of life, and I let the question linger without needing an answer. I realized that the day, in all its quiet and absence, had already begun to teach me something delicate but essential. That loneliness can be profound, but it can also be a mirror, showing us what we truly seek, what we truly need, and perhaps what we must first give to ourselves. And so I began to write in my notebook, letting the words spill like a soft river, unjudged and unfiltered, capturing the weight of the morning, the warmth of my coffee, the ache of unmet expectations, and the small budding awareness that even in solitude, life continues, and even in silence, there is a story worth telling.
As the morning drifted into afternoon, the apartment remained quiet, filled only with the soft hum of appliances and the occasional whisper of wind through the window. I kept checking my phone, though I knew deep down that it was almost futile, that the silence was not going to break unless someone made the effort, and that thought settled over me like a gentle, heavy weight. I remembered birthdays from years past, the ones that had been shared in laughter, in crowded rooms, in warm embraces, and I felt a pang, a tender, bittersweet ache that reminded me how much had changed, how much had been lost, or perhaps never fully existed outside my imagination. I wondered how I had convinced myself that online friends could replace the people who would show up in life, in living rooms with smiles and voices, and hands that held mine in real connection. I thought about the countless messages I had sent over the years, birthday wishes, check-ins, little jokes, digital hugs, and how easily they seemed to vanish into nothingness, leaving me with the echo of my own effort and the quiet absence of reciprocity. And yet, even with the ache, I didn't feel anger. There was no bitterness in me, only a gentle sadness, the kind that presses softly against your chest and makes you pause, makes you think, makes you realize that life is not always a mirror of what we expect. I began to notice the details of the apartment around me, the small potted plants on the windowsill, their leaves reaching toward the sunlight, reminding me that life continues quietly even when we feel unseen. The stacks of books on my desk, each spine a reminder of stories and worlds I had explored alone, yet never felt lonely while reading them. The gentle tick of the clock on the wall, marking time with steady patience, teaching me that hours pass whether or not anyone notices. I poured myself another cup of tea, the aroma comforting, grounding me, and I let myself sit with the solitude, feeling it fully without trying to escape. I thought about the hundreds of online friends who had once celebrated with me, who had liked my posts, who had commented and reacted, and I realized how fragile that kind of connection can be, how dependent it is on the whim of others, and how empty it can feel when the day comes and no one is there. And yet, even in that emptiness, I found a strange clarity, a moment of stillness that made me see that maybe this birthday, lonely as it was a turning point in understanding myself and the world I had built online. I started to think about the illusions we create on social media, the carefully curated images, the fleeting interactions, the small validations that feel like warmth but fade quickly, and I realized how easily one can confuse attention for affection, numbers for love, and likes for real connection. I felt the sting of that realization, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I let it settle like a gentle rain, soaking into the parts of me that needed to see clearly, that needed to confront the truth of my life without flinching. I began to notice my own habits, the way I leaned on virtual applause for comfort, the way I had quietly assumed that the people I considered friends would always be there, even when I hadn't nurtured a single true connection outside the screen. And with that awareness came a soft, trembling grief, not for anger at anyone else, but for the quiet loneliness that had crept in unnoticed over the years, the small moments when I had chosen digital comfort over real-world presence. I thought about my parents, my family, my neighbors, the people who were nearby but not often reached out to me, and I realized that I had quietly distanced myself, preferring the ease of online engagement over the messiness of actual human closeness. I felt a gentle self-reproach, but not the harsh kind, only the kind that nudges you toward reflection and understanding. And as the afternoon sunlight shifted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor, I let myself cry a little, silently, privately, feeling the tears roll down my cheeks without shame or embarrassment. They were tears of recognition, tears of loss, tears of realization that life is not always what we imagine, and that sometimes the people we think will celebrate us may not even remember we exist. I thought about the birthday cake I hadn't bought, the cards I hadn't received, the laughter I hadn't heard, and I felt the empty room around me echo those absences. Yet, even in that emptiness, I found a kind of tenderness for myself, a soft recognition that my feelings were valid, that my longing for connection was human, that my hope, though unfulfilled so far today, was not wrong. I began to write in my notebook again, letting the words flow freely, capturing the quiet sorrow and the small moments of joy I still held, the warm cup in my hands, the sunlight on my skin, the gentle sway of the trees outside. I wrote about the 400 friends who were silent, imagining each one as a story, a life full of distractions, challenges, and moments where they simply couldn't reach out. And in doing so, I softened toward them, realizing that absence doesn't always mean indifference. I imagined the small gestures that might come later, the belated messages, the unexpected notes, and I let myself feel a flicker of hope, no matter how faint. And in that quiet, reflective space, I started to feel something shift inside me, a subtle but unmistakable awareness that while birthdays are often seen as days for others to celebrate us, they can also be days for us to celebrate ourselves, to recognize our own presence in the world, to acknowledge the life we've built, even if it hasn't been exactly what we imagined. I felt a strange gratitude for the silence, for the solitude, for the way it forced me to face the reality of my connections and my own capacity for comfort and care. I began to hum softly to myself, a small, almost imperceptible melody, letting the sound fill the quiet corners of the apartment, and I realized that even in isolation, I could create warmth. Even when unnoticed, I could nurture moments of peace. And as evening approached, casting soft amber light across the room, I felt the weight of the day settle in, not as a punishment, not as a failure, but as a mirror, reflecting the truth that life is often quiet, that connections must be tended, that hope can exist even in the spaces between people. I imagined calling a friend, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, someone who lived nearby, someone who could share a small cup of tea, a few words, a laugh, and I felt that possibility glimmer gently, like a candle flame flickering in the distance. I realized that birthdays are not just about the day itself, but about the awareness they bring, the awareness of who we are, how we relate, what we value, and how we wish to be seen. And even though today had begun with silence, with absence, with a quiet ache that refused to leave, I felt a subtle shift inside me, a growing recognition that I could be present for myself, that I could honor my own existence, that I could find the warmth and attention I craved, even if it came first from within. I poured another cup of tea, sat by the window and watched the city outside come alive in the evening light, people walking, laughing, living, and I felt a quiet connection to them, not digital, not virtual, but human in its simplest, most honest form. And in that moment I whispered again, softly but firmly, "You are here, Emily. You are enough. You are seen, if not by them, then by yourself." I knew the day wasn't over yet, and maybe no one else would reach out, maybe the silence would continue. But I felt a fragile, flickering sense of peace, knowing that I had met the day with honesty, with presence, with courage to feel what I felt, and that in itself was something real, something tangible, something that no online friend count could ever take away. I realized that this quiet, lonely birthday was teaching me a lesson about life, about expectations, about the difference between presence and absence, between numbers and warmth. And I began to understand that the real gift I could give myself was acknowledgement, care, and acceptance, and that even in solitude, even with 400 silent friends, life could hold meaning, could hold beauty, could hold gentle, unspoken joy. And as the evening settled into night, I wrapped myself in a blanket, let the soft hum of the apartment lull me, and allowed myself to be fully present with the day, with the quiet, with the reality that even alone I could find moments of grace, moments of recognition, and moments that reminded me that I existed, and that in itself was enough to hold on to nurture, and carry forward into tomorrow.
I was born in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and sometimes too much about your life. My parents were simple people, kind-hearted, hardworking, but quiet in ways that made expressing feelings feel almost foreign to them. I remember my mother's gentle hands, always busy with something, cooking, sewing, tidying the house, her voice soft, careful, almost like she was always choosing her words to avoid making waves. My father was quieter still, a man of few words, who showed his love through small gestures, fixing a broken chair, carrying my books to school, making sure the garden was well tended. I grew up learning that love was often silent, that care didn't always have to be spoken, and that sometimes the absence of harsh words was its own form of comfort. I had a younger brother, Alex, who was energetic and loud, the kind of child who drew attention effortlessly, leaving me in the background, observing, listening, quietly learning to find my own small spaces of peace. My childhood was not unhappy, but it was quiet, thoughtful, and sometimes lonely in ways
I didn't fully understand until much later. I became a reader early, escaping into books that offered worlds far larger, far brighter than my own, places where characters expressed emotions freely, where friendships were vivid and enduring, and where connection felt limitless. That love of stories carried me into adolescence, where I began journaling and eventually discovering the digital spaces that would later become so central to my life. School was a mixture of comfort and challenge for me. I wasn't the most popular, nor the least. I floated somewhere in the middle, content with a few close friends, but often observing the social dances around me, fascinated by the patterns of human connection. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to understand the nuances of conversation, the subtle shifts in tone, and the ways people express themselves in ways that weren't always explicit. I had a best friend named Sarah during those years, a girl with a laugh that could fill a room, and a way of seeing the world that made every ordinary detail seem magical. We spent afternoons walking by the river, sharing secrets, hopes, and worries. And in that simplicity, I felt a kind of belonging I hadn't felt elsewhere. But as high school ended, life pulled us in different directions. She went to college in another state, and I stayed behind, feeling the slow, creeping loneliness of adulthood approaching, the subtle realization that friendships, no matter how strong, could drift apart when paths diverged. After graduation, I found work at a small bookstore, a quiet sanctuary filled with the smell of paper and coffee, and it suited me. I liked the rhythm of routine, the gentle hum of customers browsing, and the silent companionship of books lining the shelves. That's when I started exploring online communities, initially as a way to discuss novels and stories I loved. But gradually it became a place where I could reach beyond the town I lived in, beyond the quiet walls of my apartment, and connect with people who shared my thoughts, my humor, my curiosities. Slowly, the online world became a second home, a place where I could be seen, where words and ideas mattered, where friendships could flourish without the complications of real-world constraints. Over time, these digital connections grew, and I came to rely on them more than I perhaps should have. I loved the gentle ping of a message, the simple acknowledgement of a thought, the little exchanges that made me feel part of a broader world. I didn't notice at first how much of myself I was investing in this virtual reality, how the warmth of these interactions, though real in their own way, could never fully substitute for the tangible, present comfort of someone's physical company. I moved into my own apartment in the city a few years ago, a modest space filled with plants, books, soft light, and memories I carried from home. Living alone gave me freedom and independence, but it also brought a quietness that sometimes weighed heavily, especially on days like birthdays or holidays. I tried to fill it with routines, with hobbies, with the comfort of my digital friends, but there were times when the absence of real presence gnawed at me. My work at the bookstore continued, and I enjoyed the small, steady rhythm of it, helping customers find the right book, chatting briefly with regulars, arranging displays, and tending to the quiet spaces that made the store feel alive. Yet, after hours, I often felt the walls of my apartment pressing in, the silence reminding me that connections I had cultivated online, though real in part, didn't reach into this space in the same way. I had a neighbor, Mrs. Langley, who lived across the hall, an elderly woman with a gentle smile and an open heart. We would occasionally exchange small pleasantries in the hallway, discuss the weather, or share brief stories about our lives, and those interactions, though infrequent, reminded me that human contact, no matter how small, was vital. Yet, despite these interactions, I often felt a subtle distance from those around me, a quiet separation that made me turn more and more to my online communities for companionship, for acknowledgement, for the feeling of being part of something larger than myself. I had built a life that looked connected from the outside, a network of friends, a daily routine, small joys and rituals. Yet, under the surface, there was a subtle thread of loneliness, an undercurrent that pulsed quietly but persistently. I had learned to mask it, to manage it, to tell myself that this was the natural order of adult life, that solitude could be comforting, that independence was its own kind of reward. But deep down, there was a longing for real presence, for voices and laughter that could be felt in the same room, for eyes that could meet mine without a screen between us, for warmth that could be touched and shared. Birthdays especially were a reminder of this absence. I remembered past years, the small gatherings I had managed to arrange with friends from school, the notes sent with care, the laughter shared in brief, fleeting moments that left me feeling a fragile sense of belonging. But those occasions had become rarer, and the dependence on online acknowledgement had grown, until the count of friends, likes, messages, and notifications became a measure of connection, a substitute for the physical, tangible contact I had once cherished.
And yet I kept convincing myself that it was enough, that it was real, that the bonds I had nurtured digitally were as meaningful as any in-person relationship. I had a routine for birthdays, an internal checklist that gave me comfort. Wake up early, brew coffee, check messages, engage in small online interactions, maybe treat myself to a favorite meal, light a candle, reflect quietly on the past year, write in my journal, and end the day with a sense of personal accomplishment. This year, however, something felt different. As I woke up and followed the familiar steps, I noticed an unfamiliar emptiness in the expected responses, the silence of the 400 friends, and a gentle, creeping unease settled in. It was not anger, nor despair, at least not yet. It was the subtle recognition that something was missing, a gap between expectation and reality that could not be ignored. And as I moved through the day, performing the same rituals that had once brought comfort, I began to see clearly the fragility of the digital connections I had relied on, the impermanence of attention, and the absence of presence. I realized that the quiet moments of the morning, the absence of a single birthday wish, were not merely a temporary disappointment. They were a mirror, reflecting the reality of my life, the choices I had made, the reliance on connections that, while meaningful in part, could not fully sustain the human need for tangible care, warmth, and attention. And in that quiet reflection, I felt the beginnings of a deeper understanding of myself, my relationships, and the life I had built, a foundation that looked stable and connected from the outside, but in truth required a re-examination, a gentle reckoning with what I truly sought in human companionship. The apartment, with its soft light, books, and plants, became both sanctuary and mirror, showing me both the comfort I had created and the loneliness that lingered beneath. And I sat with it all, sipping my tea, feeling the quiet pull of memory and hope intertwined, knowing that the day, though still filled with absence, could also be the beginning of a journey toward a fuller understanding of connection, presence, and the fragile, beautiful reality of human relationships.
As the days went on, I reflected more on the patterns of my life, the quiet rhythms that had shaped how I was and how I moved through the world. My parents had instilled in me a sense of responsibility and care, but also a cautiousness in expressing emotion, a habit of internalizing feelings rather than sharing them openly. I carried that into my friendships, both offline and online, often holding back, observing, listening more than speaking, making sure I didn't impose or burden anyone with my needs. That carefulness had served me well in some ways. It kept me polite, considerate, and thoughtful, but it also built invisible walls, barriers that kept deep connection at a distance, even when I longed for it. I had always been curious about people, about how they felt, about what made them happy or sad. And in that curiosity, I found the beginnings of my online life, joining forums, chat groups, and communities where I could explore ideas, share thoughts, and connect without the constraints of physical presence. Over time, those online spaces became a significant part of my daily life, a place where I could be heard, acknowledged, and in some small measure, understood. I built relationships slowly but sincerely, remembering birthdays, commenting on achievements, sending supportive messages during difficult times, and feeling the warmth of reciprocal care, even if it was filtered through a screen. But I also started to notice patterns, the ebb and flow of attention, the occasional silence that left me wondering if I was truly seen or simply part of a crowd of digital acquaintances. I had a few close online friends, people I would message regularly, video call occasionally, and share parts of my life with, and they became my lifeline, the companions who made the quiet moments less heavy. Yet, even with them, I sensed the limits of digital intimacy, the subtle gaps where gestures of care could not fully reach me, where empathy could not bridge the absence of touch, presence, and shared physical experience. In my work at the bookstore, I found some solace, though it was small and fleeting, helping a young mother find a book her child would love, recommending a novel to a teenager who would later return to discuss it, arranging the shelves so that each title felt accessible, each story available. These interactions reminded me that human connection could exist in small ways, even if the weight of my loneliness remained in the quiet moments afterward. I had a few coworkers who were kind and polite, but the connections never ran deep. There were smiles, occasional conversations, shared coffee breaks, but nothing that felt like a tether to another soul, nothing that could counterbalance the quiet I often carried home with me. I also reflected on my neighbors, like Mrs. Langley across the hall, and the few familiar faces who passed in the streets, in the grocery store, and the little cafes I frequented. Their presence was comforting in a minor, almost imperceptible way, like background music that you sometimes notice and sometimes forget. And still, I relied on my online friends for the majority of emotional sustenance. The likes and comments, the messages, the virtual affirmations that reminded me that I mattered, even if only in a digital sense. I remembered when I first started celebrating birthdays online, posting a message, sharing a photo, waiting for responses. At first, it was exciting. Each notification a small thrill, each acknowledgement a tiny affirmation that I was remembered, that I existed in someone else's mind, if only briefly. Over the years, this practice grew into a habit, almost a ritual, and I began to measure my connections, my worth in part by the responses I received on these days. It was not vanity exactly, but a quiet need for acknowledgement, for evidence that my presence mattered beyond my own awareness. And yet, deep down, I knew that online attention was fleeting, unreliable, dependent on the whims and availability of others. Still, I clung to it, hoping that somewhere, someone would see me, remember me, reach out. I tried to fill the gaps in my life with routines, small acts of self-care, and personal projects, writing, reading, arranging my apartment just so, preparing meals that I loved, even if no one else shared them with me. But the longing for connection always lingered, a quiet hum under the surface. My family, meanwhile, remained part of my life, though distance and circumstance had softened the bonds in some ways. My parents had aged, slowed, grown quieter still, and while I spoke with them regularly, the conversations were polite, careful, and brief. They worried about me, I knew that, and I tried to reassure them that I was doing well, that I was happy, that I was managing. But I also knew that my happiness was measured differently than theirs, that their love was expressed in deeds and concern, while mine required acknowledgement, emotional resonance, and shared presence. I sometimes felt guilty for needing more than they could give, and yet I couldn't ignore the quiet ache that reminded me that care and love could take many forms, some of which I had yet to experience fully in real life. And so I had created a careful balance, a delicate structure where the routines of daily life, the small comforts of home, the digital friendships, and the occasional offline interactions formed a latticework of stability, even as loneliness lingered at the edges. I thought about how this structure had served me in the past, how it had allowed me to function, to thrive in my work, to nurture my own independence, and yet I also began to see its fragility, the cracks that appeared when the things I relied on, attention, acknowledgement, presence, were missing, when birthdays passed quietly, and when the absence of even a single message could weigh heavily on my heart. I remembered friends I had lost touch with, both online and offline, people who had drifted away, circumstances that had changed, conversations that had ended, and I realized that the thread of connection, no matter how carefully tended, was always subject to disruption, always at risk of leaving me facing quiet, unshared moments. And as I considered all of this, I recognized a pattern that had quietly shaped my expectations, my disappointments, and my longing. The idea that the more connections I had, the less lonely I would feel, the more validated I would be. But in truth, the number of friends, the breadth of networks, the multitude of messages and notifications could never replace the depth of real presence, the feeling of being truly seen, truly known, and truly cared for. This realization had been growing quietly in me for years, but it became undeniable on mornings like my birthday when the absence of expected attention illuminated the gaps I had ignored, the quiet spaces I had filled with digital warmth instead of tangible human closeness. And as I sat in my apartment, reflecting on these patterns, I began to understand that my journey was not just about navigating loneliness, but about discovering what I truly needed, what it meant to be seen, what it meant to feel connected beyond screens and usernames, and how I might begin to build that in my life, not in the abstract, not in numbers, but in the real present world around me. I knew it would not be easy. It would require courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to step beyond comfort zones, to risk small failures, to invest in the messy, unpredictable, and beautiful realities of human interaction. But for the first time, I felt a subtle clarity, a recognition that this birthday, lonely as it had begun, could also mark the start of a deeper awareness of myself, my connections, and the kind of life I wanted to cultivate, not online, not in numbers, not in fleeting acknowledgments, but in presence, warmth, and real enduring connection. And so, as I prepared to face the rest of the day, I carried with me a quiet sense of resolve, a gentle hope that even in solitude, even with absence, and silence, I could begin to understand and nurture the bonds that mattered most, the ones that could bring warmth not just to my screen, but to my life, my heart, and my soul.
My quiet birthday began like any other, but I felt a subtle shift in the rhythm of my life, a growing awareness of gaps that had always existed, but now seemed impossible to ignore. I checked my messages more often than usual, hoping for belated birthday wishes or notes of care. But each time I was met with silence or delayed responses, the kind that made me question whether my presence mattered at all. Even my closest online friends were distracted or busy, their replies coming hours later, short, perfunctory, leaving a hollow echo in the space where warmth was expected. I tried to rationalize it. People were busy, lives moved on, no one intended harm. But the ache of absence lingered, growing quietly, persistently. At the bookstore, my days felt heavier, though nothing had changed in the work itself. Helping customers, arranging books, the rhythm of the cash register, even the scent of coffee. These were constants, but the internal echo of my longing for connection seemed louder, sharper. I noticed myself staring longer at the door, imagining someone I knew walking in, just to share a brief smile, a conversation, a reminder that I was part of a world outside my apartment and my screens. My routines began to feel fragile, the small comforts I relied on no longer holding the same weight, and I realized how much I had depended on digital affirmation for my sense of belonging. I found myself replaying past interactions in my mind, analyzing messages, comparing them to what I had expected, wondering where the warmth had gone, why a friendly note or an acknowledgement hadn't arrived. It was subtle at first, just a quiet tension that made me restless, made me check notifications more frequently, made me linger on platforms longer than usual, searching for connection that seemed just out of reach. I noticed changes in my body, too, the tightening in my chest, the restlessness in my hands, the light ache in my temples that came from waiting, from hoping, from quietly expecting that someone would reach out and confirm that I mattered. I tried to distract myself with small projects in the apartment, rearranging bookshelves, cleaning, planting new flowers, but even these tasks, usually comforting, now seemed insufficient to fill the growing emptiness I felt inside. I began to withdraw subtly from the few offline interactions I had, the brief chats with Mrs. Langley in the hallway, the polite exchanges with coworkers, the smiles and greetings of neighbors, and I realized with a quiet pang that I was retreating further into the digital spaces that had once been a source of warmth, but were now highlighting their own limitations. One evening, I received a short message from a friend I had considered close, a simple, "Hope your birthday went well," and I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that someone remembered, and disappointment that it came so late, so brief, so lacking the depth of connection I had imagined. I began to question whether I had misjudged the friendships I had built online, whether I had placed too much faith in people who were, after all, navigating their own lives and often unavailable to truly witness mine. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying, and it set off a series of reflections that made each day feel heavier, each interaction tinged with the faint edge of doubt and longing. Even the small routines that had once brought comfort, morning coffee, journaling, tending to the plants, now carried a subtle undertone of melancholy, a reminder that the world beyond my apartment was moving. People were living, laughing, connecting, and I was still here, quietly hoping, quietly waiting, quietly unacknowledged. I noticed that I was less inclined to respond promptly to messages, less eager to initiate conversations, almost testing the waters to see who truly cared, who would reach out. And in doing so, I felt a quiet, gnawing anxiety, the kind that comes from recognizing your own neediness and wishing it weren't so. I started avoiding certain online spaces, scrolling past posts that reminded me of gatherings, celebrations, shared laughter, anything that emphasized my absence rather than my presence. And in that avoidance, I realized how fragile my reliance on digital attention had become. I began to imagine scenarios in my head, Friends forgetting, ignoring, moving on, birthday wishes being lost or deemed unimportant. The realization that my existence in their minds was optional, fleeting, secondary. Each imagined slight tightened the chest, made the quiet ache more pronounced, and I found myself wondering whether I had been naive, whether my heart had invested too much in people who could never fully see me, never fully value my presence. The isolation began to feel heavier, and even small disappointments felt amplified in the quiet apartment, where there was no one to witness my struggle, no one to offer comfort, and no distraction from the hollow echo of unmet expectation. I tried to talk to myself gently, to remind myself that friendship is not always constant, that life interferes, that people are distracted, that none of it was personal. But each reassurance felt fragile, fleeting, insufficient to fully counter the creeping tension inside. Even my writing, once a refuge, now felt tinged with melancholy. I documented feelings, yes, but the act of doing so reminded me of absence, of distance, of the gap between the life I imagined and the one unfolding quietly around me. I began to notice small irritations that I had previously ignored. The delayed replies, the missed check-ins, the lack of spontaneous messages, and each one, though minor on its own, accumulated into a slow, gnawing sense of being unseen, of being forgotten, of being valued less than I had hoped. I wondered if anyone truly understood me, if anyone truly cared about the small moments that mattered most, if anyone could sense the quiet, steady ache that accompanied the digital warmth that could never fully reach me. And in that wondering, the tension inside grew, a subtle but persistent pressure that made mornings heavier, afternoons longer, and nights feel lonely even in the comfort of my apartment. I realized that I was beginning to measure my own worth against responses I might never receive, to base my happiness on the attention and acknowledgement of people who are often absent, distracted, and imperfect in their care. It was a slow, creeping awareness, one that unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, until I could no longer ignore the truth that the more I depended on these digital connections for my emotional sustenance, the more fragile and unsteady I felt, and the more the quiet absences began to weigh on me. I started noticing myself rehearsing responses in my head, imagining conversations that would never occur, replaying past messages, interpreting silences as subtle judgments or proof of neglect. I felt a gentle anxiety rising, a restlessness that made it difficult to concentrate, difficult to immerse myself in work, difficult to find comfort in the routines that had once soothed me. Even the presence of my apartment, my familiar and comforting surroundings, could not completely counter the subtle sense of imbalance, the growing awareness that the life I had carefully built online, the 400 friends I had counted on for connection, could not truly fill the spaces I longed to occupy in the hearts and minds of those I cared about. And so, each day became a negotiation, a quiet battle between hope and disappointment, between expectation and reality, between the longing for acknowledgement and the realization that it might never arrive. And in that tension, I began to feel the first stirrings of a deeper understanding that perhaps my reliance on absence-filled digital warmth had created a fragility in my emotional life, that one that could no longer be ignored or rationalized away, and that I would have to confront, carefully and honestly, if I wanted to find any sense of lasting connection, fulfillment, or peace.
The following days only intensified the quiet turmoil I was beginning to feel, as if the weight of absence and unmet expectations had begun to seep into every corner of my life. I noticed myself becoming more hesitant, more withdrawn, even with the few people I did see in person. The cashier at the grocery store who always smiled, the regular customer at the bookstore who asked about my day, even Mrs. Langley who still offered a gentle wave from across the hall. The interactions that once brought warmth now felt insufficient, almost hollow, because they highlighted what I was missing rather than what was present. I spent longer hours online, scrolling through feeds, checking messages, opening and closing chat windows, searching for a spark of connection that felt genuine, that reminded me I was seen, that reminded me I mattered. But the responses I received, when they came, were brief, delayed, polite, but distant, leaving me to navigate the echo of longing on my own.
I began noticing patterns in myself that made me uncomfortable, checking repeatedly, comparing interactions, reading too much into the timing of messages, feeling hurt when someone didn't reply immediately, wondering if a friend's silence meant I was insignificant to them. It was a subtle, creeping anxiety, one that I tried to mask with routines and small tasks, but it became increasingly hard to ignore. The apartment that had once been a sanctuary now sometimes felt like a cage, a quiet place that amplified the absence of human warmth. I found myself imagining conversations with friends that would never happen, rehearsing messages I might send but never did, wondering if my carefully cultivated relationships were more fragile than I had allowed myself to admit. Even work, which I had always found grounding, began to feel heavier. I noticed how much effort I had to expend to maintain my usual calm and cheerful demeanor, while inside, I felt frayed, unsure, and vulnerable. Small irritations became more pronounced. The missed text from a friend I had trusted, the lack of engagement from someone I considered close, the gentle but unavoidable reality that life moved on around me while I remained tethered to a hope that was increasingly unfulfilled. I began withdrawing further from the world outside my apartment, avoiding social situations that might highlight my isolation, declining invitations even when I wanted to go because the fear of disappointment had started to outweigh the desire for connection. Each digital interaction became a test, a measure of how much I mattered to someone else, and each small perceived failure chipped away at my sense of self, leaving a fragile, aching awareness that perhaps the life I had carefully built online was not as sustaining as I had believed. One evening, I received a message from a friend I had considered one of my closest allies online. It was a short, almost casual note, asking for a small favor, mentioning my birthday only in passing. I felt a sudden sharp pang of hurt, not from the message itself, but from what it represented. A reminder that the people I had counted on for emotional connection were engaged with their own lives, their own priorities, often forgetting or overlooking me entirely. I wanted to respond with understanding, with patience, but instead I felt an unexpected sting, a quiet resentment I had never felt before, and I realized that my reliance on these digital connections had made me vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. The realization hit me slowly, like a tide creeping over the sand, that I had built my emotional world on foundations that were not always reliable, not always present, and not always reciprocal. The sadness deepened, now tinged with frustration and a subtle anger I had never allowed myself to feel. A recognition that my hopes and expectations were not being met, not because I was unworthy, but because the structure I had relied on was inherently unstable. I began noticing physical manifestations of this tension: tightness in my chest, restless energy in my limbs, difficulty sleeping, a lingering fatigue that routine and comfort alone could not soothe. Even the simple pleasure of a cup of coffee, the aroma and warmth that once brought solace, now felt fleeting, almost inconsequential in the face of my quiet, growing awareness that something essential was missing. And in that recognition, I started to see my patterns more clearly. The retreat into digital spaces, the measuring of my worth through the attention and presence of others, the subtle, constant negotiation between hope and disappointment. Each day became an emotional balancing act, a careful attempt to manage feelings of isolation while maintaining a semblance of calm, a routine, a life that looked whole to the outside world. But inside, I felt increasingly unsteady, as if the quiet stability I had cultivated was beginning to fracture under the weight of absence and unmet longing. I noticed myself reacting more sharply to minor slights, feeling sadness where before I would have felt neutral, dwelling on moments of oversight that previously would have passed unnoticed. And yet, I could not entirely pull myself away from the very things that caused this tension because they were the closest thing I had to connection, the threads that kept me tethered to a sense of belonging, however fragile and incomplete. I became aware of an internal conflict I had long avoided acknowledging, the tension between the safety and predictability of my digital world and the vulnerability and unpredictability of seeking connection in the real, tangible world. I realized that in choosing the former, I had insulated myself from some disappointments, but I had also limited my capacity for fulfillment, for warmth, for the kind of human presence I craved most. And in this growing awareness that quiet tension became almost palpable, a steady, pressing undercurrent that shaped my thoughts, my moods, my perceptions of myself and the people around me. I noticed myself imagining confrontations, imagining explanations, imagining scenarios in which I asked for care, for attention, for recognition, and feeling both shame and fear for wanting such things. The paradox of needing others while fearing their inadequacy to meet that need was exhausting, emotionally and mentally, and I felt the quiet pressure mounting day by day. Small events, previously inconsequential, began to feel heavy. An unanswered message, a delayed reply, the absence of a thoughtful note, the fleeting attention of someone I had trusted. And each of these tiny absences, seemingly insignificant on their own, accumulated into a slow, steady crescendo of emotional tension that I could not easily dissipate. I became aware of a subtle shift in my behavior, noticing that I was more reactive, more cautious, more hesitant to invest emotionally, yet simultaneously more desperate for acknowledgement, caught in a loop that left me exhausted and quietly wounded. Even as I tried to immerse myself in my routines, my work, my small pleasures, the tension followed, an uninvited companion that whispered reminders of absence, of longing, of unmet expectations. And I began to realize that the birthday that had started with quiet loneliness was not a singular event, but a reflection of deeper patterns that had quietly shaped my life for years. And in that realization, I felt both fear and clarity. Fear for the fragility I had built my emotional life upon, and clarity for the first time that unless something changed, I would continue to experience the quiet ache of longing, the persistent undercurrent of disappointment, and the subtle but undeniable sense that the connections I relied on were not fully sufficient to nourish the heart I had carried for so long. The tension, unspoken and unseen, pressed in from all directions, shaping my days, my thoughts, my sense of self. And I realized with a gentle but firm certainty that this was the moment when awareness had to transform into action, when recognition had to become a turning point, when the quiet ache of unmet expectations would either grow into despair or catalyze a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be seen, to be valued, and to seek connection beyond the fragile digital threads I had woven over the years.
It was a Thursday evening when everything seemed to tilt, subtly at first, like a gentle wind that eventually turns into a steady gust, reshaping the landscape of a quiet life. I had spent the day as usual, tending to my small routines, sipping tea by the window, writing in my journal, checking messages, and hoping, as I always did, for a moment of connection that felt real, that reminded me I mattered beyond the numbers of friends, likes, and reactions. But that evening, as I opened my inbox, I found a message that made my heart tighten with a strange, unfamiliar weight. It was from someone I had considered a close, steadfast online friend, someone who had shared years of conversations with me, who had been a presence in both joyous and difficult moments, and the tone of the message was curt, dismissive, and almost unrecognizable. They wrote in few words that they didn't have time to chat, that my expectations were too much, that I needed to understand that life was not about constant attention or reassurance. I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen above the keyboard, the words sinking into me slowly, almost painfully, like heavy drops of rain on a quiet pond, disturbing the surface and sending ripples deep into my chest. I read the message again, hoping I had misunderstood, that perhaps context was missing, that there was a gentle intention behind the harsh phrasing. But no matter how carefully I examined it, the truth was undeniable. Someone I had trusted, someone I had counted on for emotional presence, was setting a boundary that felt in that moment like rejection. A wave of mixed emotions swept over me: hurt, confusion, sadness, and a quiet, simmering sense of anger I had never allowed myself to feel before. I realized that I had placed a large part of my emotional well-being in the hands of people who were not always capable of giving it back. And the fragility of that trust now became painfully clear. I felt tears prick at my eyes, the quiet ache that had been growing for weeks now breaking through in a rush of vulnerability that I could no longer contain. I closed my laptop and sat in silence, letting the room hold me as the reality settled in, the realization that even the closest of online relationships, carefully nurtured over time, could falter, could disappoint, and could leave me feeling alone in ways that nothing else seemed to fill. For the first time in years, I felt a strange, raw loneliness. Not the gentle, reflective kind I had grown accustomed to, but a sharp, insistent ache that made me confront the limits of the life I had built for myself. I thought about the 400 friends, the constant interactions, the carefully maintained network of people, and realized that quantity had never equaled quality, that the depth of connection I craved had always been elusive, and now the illusion was stripped bare.
I felt a subtle fear creeping in, the fear that this loneliness was permanent, that my emotional life was fragile, and that I had been, in some ways, unprepared for the realities of human connection. I reflected on the moments I had spent hoping for messages, for acknowledgement, for reassurance, and now I saw them as both beautiful and dangerous, tender and vulnerable, and I recognized the risk I had taken by placing so much of my heart in spaces that could not fully sustain it. That evening, I tried to reach out to other friends, to fill the sudden emptiness with conversation, with reassurance, with attempts at connection. But each response I received felt fleeting, perfunctory, unable to penetrate the core of the loneliness that had surfaced. And in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by books and plants, by memories of past birthdays and imagined moments of presence, I realized that the life I had cultivated online, though comforting and sometimes joyful, had gaps that could no longer be ignored, that my reliance on virtual affirmation had left me vulnerable, and that this was a turning point in understanding the true nature of my emotional needs. I felt an almost physical weight pressing on my chest, a heaviness that demanded acknowledgement, that demanded a reckoning with my own choices, my own patterns, and my own responsibility for seeking connection in ways that might be more grounded, more tangible, more real. I began to see clearly how I had unconsciously placed expectation upon expectation on people who could not always deliver, and how this pattern had quietly shaped my emotional landscape, leaving me unprepared for moments like this, when absence turned into acute, undeniable loneliness. For hours, I sat with the tension, letting it wash over me, letting the quiet tears fall, letting the reality of my own vulnerability fill the spaces that digital interactions could never reach. And as I did, I began to notice subtle truths forming in the edges of my awareness, truths about resilience, about self-recognition, about the power of understanding one's own needs without demanding them entirely from others. I recognized that while the message had been painful, it was also honest, a rare clarity in the otherwise shifting and sometimes unreliable landscape of online relationships. And in that clarity, a strange, bittersweet relief emerged, a sense that, though hurt, I was being shown something important: the boundaries of others, the limits of digital intimacy, and the urgent necessity of cultivating connection that was real, reciprocal, and present. I thought about the small steps I could take, the ways I could gently bridge the gap between the life I had built online and the human presence I craved in the physical world, and for the first time, I began to imagine a path forward, tentative and uncertain, but grounded in reality rather than expectation. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of disappointment and the flicker of awareness intertwining, a strange blend of sorrow and insight that refused to let me sleep easily, but also refused to let me despair entirely. I realized that the turning point was not just about the message, the rejection, or the absence of attention. It was about understanding. Truly understanding that my emotional life could no longer depend solely on the fragile currents of digital affirmation. It was about recognizing my own agency, my own responsibility, and the necessity of seeking connection that was not contingent on likes, replies, or virtual presence, but on tangible, heartfelt engagement with the people and the world around me. And as the ache of loneliness persisted, and as the sharp sting of unmet expectations lingered, I felt a subtle transformation begin, a gentle but unmistakable shift in perspective, as if the very weight of absence had carved space for new awareness, new understanding, and the possibility of cultivating relationships and moments that could finally nourish the heart in ways I had long imagined but never fully realized.
Days that followed that message became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of the emotional world I had quietly constructed for myself, and the turning point deepened as I faced the consequences of investing so heavily in connections that were, at their core, transient and imperfect. I noticed myself withdrawing more from the digital spaces that had once been a source of comfort, hesitant to engage in conversations that might leave me feeling exposed, anxious, or disappointed, yet simultaneously craving acknowledgement, a paradox that made each interaction feel like walking a tightrope. The silence of those who had been present in my life online was deafening, and with every day that passed without meaningful communication, the quiet ache within me intensified, no longer subtle but insistent, shaping my moods, my thoughts, and my sense of self.
I began to examine my own expectations, recognizing that I had placed them on others rather than cultivating the inner resilience to navigate loneliness without judgment. And that awareness, though painful, became a catalyst for introspection. I felt the sting of reality pressing in, the understanding that even friendships built over years, nurtured with care and consistency, could falter, could be unreliable, and could leave me facing emotional emptiness despite the appearance of connection. It was a realization that unsettled me deeply, shaking the foundations of comfort I had relied upon, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truth that I could not control the actions or attentions of others, only my own responses and choices. I spent long hours reflecting, writing in my journal, documenting every feeling, tracing every thought, trying to understand the patterns that had led me here. I realized that the loneliness I experienced was not merely the absence of others, but also the absence of a fully engaged presence in my own life, the lack of intentional, real-world connections that could provide sustenance beyond digital affirmation. One afternoon, I decided to step outside, to walk through the city streets without my phone, without screens to mediate my interactions, seeking a kind of grounding I had rarely allowed myself. I noticed the small details, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the soft chatter of strangers, the sunlight glinting off windows, and felt a strange combination of awe and quiet sorrow, a reminder that the world moved forward regardless of my digital disappointments. I began to realize that I had been living partially in a world of expectation, of hope for acknowledgement, and that by doing so, I had overlooked the tangible, real moments around me that could provide comfort, connection, and meaning. It was both sobering and liberating to understand that while my online friends were part of my life, they could never replace the depth of presence that comes from sharing space, time, and attention with someone who is physically there, fully attentive and engaged. That realization brought a subtle but undeniable shift. I began reaching out differently, tentatively, not to demand attention or affirmation, but to nurture relationships that could offer mutual presence. I sent simple messages, invitations to meet, small gestures of care that did not expect instant return, and slowly a few people responded with warmth and willingness, reminding me that connection was possible, even if it required patience, courage, and vulnerability. I also began to reevaluate my own patterns, understanding that my dependence on digital interactions had created a fragile emotional scaffold, one that needed reinforcement through real-world engagement, through empathy, reciprocity, and shared experience beyond screens. And as I reflected, I realized that the turning point was not simply about hurt or disappointment. It was about awakening, about seeing the limits of my previous approach, about recognizing that the fullness of human connection required presence, intention, and courage to step beyond the comfort of familiar but insufficient routines. The experience forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, that I had relied too heavily on others for validation, that I had measured my worth by responses that were unpredictable and inconsistent, and that I had neglected the cultivation of presence and engagement in the physical spaces I inhabited. But even as these truths pressed on me, I felt a quiet, emerging strength, a sense that by acknowledging these patterns, by facing the ache directly, I could begin to transform the way I related to myself and others. The turning point, in its quiet and painful way, became a doorway, a moment where grief, loneliness, and disappointment converged to illuminate a path forward, one where I could seek real connection without dependency, embrace presence without expectation, and nurture relationships that were both grounding and reciprocal. I took slow steps toward change, starting with small, intentional acts, visiting Mrs. Langley more often, joining a local book club, inviting a neighbor for tea, even volunteering at the community library. Each gesture, though minor, was a tangible assertion of agency, a conscious decision to bridge the gap between the solitude I had experienced and the human presence I desired. And in these moments, I began to sense a new rhythm in my life, a blend of reflection, action, and tentative hope, where loneliness no longer felt like an insurmountable weight, but a quiet signal guiding me toward meaningful engagement. I recognized that the pain of absence had a purpose. It forced me to see clearly, to act courageously, and to cultivate presence in ways that were deliberate rather than passive. The turning point had fully arrived, not as a dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, but as a steady, persistent awareness that reshaped how I approached myself, my relationships, and the world around me. And as days turned into weeks, I began to notice subtle changes, moments of shared laughter with new acquaintances, conversations that felt grounding rather than perfunctory, and a growing sense of self-respect and emotional resilience that had been missing when I relied solely on the fragile currents of digital attention. I realized that the hurt I had felt, though intense, had created space for growth, and that through acknowledging and navigating my emotions, I could begin to cultivate connections that were real, sustaining, and reciprocal, rather than fleeting and dependent on the convenience of others. By the time the month had passed, I could see clearly the lessons embedded in the turning point, the necessity of presence, the importance of mutual care, the limits of virtual acknowledgement, and the value of intentionally seeking relationships and moments that nourished the heart rather than expecting sustenance from spaces that could not fully provide it. And in this understanding, a sense of quiet peace began to emerge, a recognition that while loneliness and disappointment were inevitable at times, they also held the seeds of awareness, growth, and the possibility of deeper, more meaningful connection that could transform not just a birthday or a week or a month, but the very way I lived, loved, and engaged with the world around me.
That turning point unfolded slowly, quietly, as if my life itself needed time to recalibrate, to allow the lessons of loneliness, disappointment, and emotional fragility to sink deeply into my consciousness. I began to approach each day with a deliberate gentleness, noticing small things I had overlooked before: the warmth of sunlight spilling through the windows, the comforting hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen, the subtle patterns of life outside my apartment that reminded me the world continued, indifferent yet beautiful. I started intentionally reaching out to people around me, not online, not expecting immediate acknowledgement, but with a quiet openness, a willingness to be present without demanding reciprocity. I visited Mrs. Langley more often, sitting with her in the afternoons, listening to her stories, offering small gestures of care, and in return, I found myself held in a gentle rhythm of shared presence that had been missing from my life for years. I joined the local book club, initially with hesitation, fearing judgment, fearing that my quiet loneliness would make me an outsider, but the warmth of human engagement, the small smiles, the soft encouragement, and the laughter over shared stories reminded me that connection could be found in reality, not just in screens. I invited a neighbor for tea one afternoon, and the conversation flowed effortlessly, gentle yet meaningful, and I realized with a quiet, tender relief that meaningful relationships could exist, that presence could be shared without the fragility I had come to associate with digital interactions. I even began volunteering at the community library, helping with reading programs, assisting children and adults in finding the books that resonated with them. And in the act of giving care, of offering attention, I found a quiet joy, a gentle affirmation that my presence mattered beyond the screens, beyond likes, beyond messages that arrived late or not at all. Slowly, day by day, the tension that had built over months, the quiet anxiety, the persistent ache of unmet expectations, began to ease, replaced by a sense of grounding, a feeling that I could cultivate my own emotional life without being entirely dependent on others for validation. I journaled regularly, not as a means of measuring attention or waiting for someone to respond, but as a process of self-reflection, of acknowledging my own needs, of tracing patterns and learning from them. And through this practice, I began to understand myself more clearly, my longings, my vulnerabilities, and my capacity for resilience. I still felt moments of loneliness, of course, and occasionally a pang of sadness when remembering the birthday that had passed in quiet isolation. But these feelings were tempered now by the awareness that they were natural, human, and manageable, rather than overwhelming or defining. I developed small rituals of care for myself: morning walks, preparing meals I loved, tending to my plants with patience, reading books that brought solace, and allowing myself to enjoy these simple pleasures without guilt or the need for external acknowledgement. Gradually, I began to notice subtle but meaningful shifts in my mindset. The quiet patience that had been replaced by anxiety returned, the longing for connection transformed into an openness to receive it in real and tangible ways, and I began to recognize that the discomfort of solitude could coexist with the joy of presence when I actively sought it. I strengthened my bonds with local friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, nurturing relationships with attention, thoughtfulness, and kindness, and in doing so, I experienced a gentle reciprocity that was both grounding and sustaining. At the same time, I redefined my online interactions, maintaining contact with digital friends, but without the same emotional dependence,
the same expectation that the responses would validate my sense of self. Messages became a delight rather than a necessity, notifications a pleasant surprise rather than a measure of worth, and I could enjoy online engagement without it shaping my emotional equilibrium. I discovered the power of presence, of physical engagement, of being truly seen by someone who could witness my presence in a tangible way. And I realized that this presence was not always dramatic or loud, but subtle, steady, and enduring, forming the foundation for a life that felt rich and connected. I learned to appreciate the nuances of human interaction, the pauses, the shared smiles, the quiet understanding, the small acts of care that might seem insignificant but carried deep resonance when experienced in person. And in cultivating these connections, I also cultivated self-respect, self-awareness, and a gentleness toward my own emotional needs, recognizing that my worth was not contingent on the attention of others, but on the care I offered and the presence I maintained, both for myself and for those around me. Slowly, I began to reclaim my apartment as a space of comfort, warmth, and sanctuary, no longer a stage for longing or disappointment, but a place where reflection, creativity, and engagement could coexist. I hosted small gatherings, shared meals with neighbors, invited friends over for tea and conversation. And in those moments, I felt the subtle but undeniable affirmation that I was not alone, that my presence mattered, and that meaningful connection was not a distant hope, but an attainable reality when nurtured with care. I reflected often on the turning point, the painful message, the quiet loneliness, the sharp ache of unmet expectation, and I realized that it had been a necessary catalyst, a moment of clarity that forced me to see patterns, to recognize limitations, and to take deliberate steps toward building a life with more depth, more presence, and more grounded connection. Even the challenges that remained, the occasional pangs of loneliness, the missed interactions, the moments of self-doubt, were now experienced differently, as reminders to engage gently with myself, to act intentionally, and to seek connection in ways that were both sustainable and authentic. I felt gratitude for the process of change, for the subtle shift from dependence to agency, from expectation to openness, and from passive hope to active engagement. And I began to sense that the life I was now cultivating, though imperfect and evolving, held a quiet, enduring richness that had eluded me in the past. And as I moved through each day, with mindful attention and gentle intention, I felt the subtle power of resilience, of presence, and of connection that was real, tangible, and sustaining. A reminder that even in the aftermath of loneliness, of disappointment, and of emotional fragility, it was possible to rebuild, to grow, and to cultivate a life filled with warmth, meaning, and quiet joy. As the weeks unfolded, I found myself settling into a rhythm that felt both grounding and gentle, a quiet continuity that allowed the lessons from the turning point to take root in my life. And I began noticing changes that had previously been impossible to perceive amidst the weight of loneliness. The moments that once felt hollow, the casual greetings from neighbors, the brief exchanges with coworkers, the small kindnesses from strangers, now carried a subtle but profound significance, reminding me that connection was often quieter than I expected, yet no less meaningful. I took deliberate steps to nurture relationships that mattered, both old and new, allowing conversations to unfold without expectation, and discovering that when I approached others with patience and openness, warmth was reciprocated naturally, without the burden of pressure or anticipation. I spent more time engaging with the world outside my apartment, walking through parks, visiting cafes, attending local events, and simply being present in spaces where life moved steadily and quietly around me. Each interaction, however small, became a thread weaving into the tapestry of a more resilient emotional life, and I noticed with a soft relief that the ache of loneliness no longer dominated my thoughts as it had for so long. Even my online presence shifted. I continued to engage with friends, but without the emotional dependence that had previously left me so vulnerable. Messages were now a pleasure rather than a lifeline, a reminder of connection rather than a measure of worth. I explored creative outlets more intentionally, writing, drawing, and reflecting on my experiences with a calm honesty, allowing the quiet contemplation to clarify my needs, my desires, and my capacity for both solitude and companionship. Gradually, the anxiety and restlessness that had once accompanied waiting for responses, for acknowledgement, or for affirmation began to soften, replaced by a steadier, gentler awareness that I could sustain myself emotionally, even in moments of quiet or absence. I developed a new understanding of what it meant to be present, not just for others, but for myself, allowing the quiet rhythms of life to teach patience, resilience, and the subtle beauty of moments often overlooked. I reconnected with my parents in a more mindful way, engaging in conversations with intention, listening deeply, and appreciating the ways they cared for me without demanding that their attention fit into my expectations. These exchanges, small but significant, reminded me that presence came in many forms, and that love could be quiet yet unwavering. My apartment, once a space that reflected isolation and longing, became a sanctuary of reflection and comfort, filled with objects, books, and plants that brought me a tangible sense of joy. And I felt a subtle pride in the life I had intentionally cultivated within these walls. I noticed that my thoughts about my birthday, once a symbol of absence and disappointment, now carried a gentle lesson rather than pain. A reminder that expectations must be tempered with awareness, that connection requires both courage and patience, and that meaningful relationships are built over time, grounded in mutual presence rather than fleeting acknowledgement. I spent evenings with friends from the neighborhood, sharing stories and laughter over tea, feeling the warmth of human presence that I had so longed for, and realizing that while the ache of previous loneliness lingered in memory, it no longer dictated the rhythm of my days or the shape of my heart. I also discovered a quiet joy in giving and offering my attention, care, and time to others, whether through volunteering, helping a neighbor, or simply listening with intention. And I began to notice that the act of nurturing others brought a profound sense of fulfillment that had been absent when I sought sustenance primarily from digital connections. My sense of self, once fragile and dependent on external acknowledgement, grew steadier, more resilient, rooted in the understanding that my worth was inherent, that my presence mattered, and that I could cultivate connection while honoring both my needs and the boundaries of others. Slowly, I allowed myself to experience vulnerability without fear, to reach out, to invite, to engage, and to participate in life fully, discovering that the risk of disappointment was far outweighed by the richness of genuine interaction, and that human connection, though unpredictable, was always possible when approached with intention, care, and patience. I reflected on the months of quiet longing, the tension, the disappointment, and the turning point, and I realized that every step, however painful, had been necessary to lead me to this place of quiet strength, clarity, and emotional resilience. Even moments of solitude, once feared and avoided, became spaces of calm reflection and gentle restoration, allowing me to center myself, process my emotions, and prepare to engage with the world from a place of balance and awareness. I noticed subtle patterns emerging in my life, the interplay of presence and absence, giving and receiving, solitude and companionship, and began to navigate them with a newfound grace, understanding that emotional life was neither linear nor predictable, but could be guided by mindfulness, intention, and the cultivation of meaningful connection. As I continued to nurture both old and new relationships, I recognized that the true measure of connection was not in quantity, not in rapid responses or constant attention, but in depth, presence, and reciprocity, the quiet moments of shared understanding that left a lasting impact, even if they occurred infrequently. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experiences that had brought me here, for the ache that had led to awareness, for the turning point that had forced reflection, and for the patient unfolding of insight that allowed me to embrace both solitude and companionship without fear. In this resolution, I discovered the subtle art of living fully, of seeking connection without dependency, of valuing presence without demanding it, and of cultivating a life that was rich not because of numbers or external validation, but because of intentional care, awareness, and the gentle nurturing of both self and others. And as the weeks settled into months, I felt a quiet, enduring peace, a gentle warmth in my chest, a soft, steady joy in the act of being fully alive, fully present, and fully engaged with the people and world around me, knowing that the ache of loneliness had not been wasted, but had led me, step by step, toward the richness, connection, and serenity I had longed for all along.
Looking back on that lonely birthday, I see now that it was not just a day marked by absence, but a turning point that quietly reshaped the way I approach life, connection, and my own heart. For so long, I had measured my worth through digital responses, counting friends, likes, and messages as proof that I mattered, and I failed to notice that the richness I craved could not be found on a screen. The silence I experienced, the absence of attention on that day, felt like a weight pressing on me, and at first I thought it meant I was unseen, unimportant, forgotten. But as time passed and reflection grew, I realized it had been an invitation to look deeper, to seek presence, and to cultivate connection in ways that were more grounded, more tangible, and more meaningful. I came to understand that the pain of disappointment and the ache of unmet expectations were not punishments, but signals guiding me toward a more intentional life. I learned to notice the small, subtle ways people could care, even if they were not always consistent or perfectly attuned to my desires. I learned to appreciate the quiet gestures, a neighbor's smile, a friend's simple check-in, a shared laugh over coffee, because these moments, however brief, were genuine and present. I began to approach my own needs with gentleness, recognizing that seeking care from others was natural, but that my emotional foundation could not be built entirely on what others chose to give. Instead, I nurtured myself, tending to routines, creative pursuits, and the life around me with awareness and intention, finding joy in moments of self-care and reflection. I allowed myself to step outside my apartment more often, to meet people in person, to take small risks in reaching out, and I discovered that human connection, though sometimes unpredictable, was always possible when approached with patience, courage, and authenticity. I learned that the turning point, the message that had hurt me, the quiet ache that followed, the solitude that had felt unbearable, had been a gift in disguise, teaching me the value of presence, the importance of patience, and the strength that comes from understanding and navigating my own heart. I discovered that connection is not a matter of numbers, not a tally of online interactions, but a matter of shared presence, intention, and genuine care, and that even small, simple interactions can carry profound meaning when they are heartfelt. Looking back, I feel gratitude for the loneliness I endured, for the moments of quiet reflection, and for the subtle lessons that shape the way I now engage with the world. I realize that life is a delicate balance between solitude and companionship, between giving and receiving, and that emotional resilience is cultivated not by avoiding hurt, but by facing it, understanding it, and allowing it to guide growth. My birthday, once a symbol of absence and longing, now stands as a reminder of transformation, a quiet marker of the moment I began to navigate life with greater awareness, presence, and emotional maturity. And as I move forward, I carry with me the understanding that every moment of loneliness can hold a lesson, every ache of unmet expectation can lead to self-discovery, and every quiet turning point can open the door to deeper, more meaningful connections that bring warmth, joy, and fulfillment to life. In the calm that now fills my days, I can sit with the knowledge that being present for both myself and others is the truest measure of connection, and that even in moments of solitude, the heart can grow, reflect, and prepare to welcome the genuine, sustaining relationships that life offers when we approach it with openness, patience, and intention. As I sit quietly now reflecting on the months that followed that lonely birthday, I realize that the isolation I once feared so deeply became a teacher, guiding me to a richer understanding of myself and the ways I relate to others. I no longer measure my worth by the speed of a reply or the number of messages waiting in an inbox. Instead, I notice the quality of presence, the small gestures of care, and the moments of genuine attention that cannot be quantified but can be felt deeply in the heart. I understand that solitude, once heavy and unwelcome, can also be nourishing, offering space for reflection, creativity, and emotional growth, and that being alone does not equate to being insignificant. The friendships I once relied upon solely online are now balanced with meaningful, tangible connections, neighbors who stop to chat, friends I meet in person for coffee, conversations that flow naturally without expectation or pressure. I have learned to value patience, to let relationships unfold organically, and to offer my care without demanding it in return, recognizing that the beauty of human connection lies in its subtle reciprocity, not its immediacy. My daily routines, once mechanical and uninspired, have gained a sense of mindfulness. I pause to notice the little joys, the scent of freshly brewed tea, the warmth of sunlight on my skin, the quiet hum of the city outside my window, and in these moments I find a profound sense of contentment and grounding. I have discovered that emotional resilience is not about avoiding disappointment or shielding oneself from hurt, but by facing it, understanding it, and allowing it to guide the choices I make about where to invest my energy, attention, and heart. Looking back, I realized that the loneliness of that birthday, painful as it was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a deeper, more authentic chapter of life in which I could navigate the balance between solitude and companionship with clarity and calm. I have learned that hope is not about expecting constant affirmation from others, but about nurturing the capacity to feel whole even in quiet moments, to create spaces where connection can flourish naturally, and to recognize the beauty in both giving and receiving care. In the stillness, I reflect on the subtle lessons of patience, presence, and self-awareness,
The understanding that life's richness often resides not in dramatic gestures, but in consistent, heartfelt engagement with the people and world around us. And as I move forward, I carry a quiet, enduring sense of peace, knowing that I am capable of cultivating joy, connection, and meaning on my own terms, that my heart is resilient, and that the ache of loneliness, though once powerful, can transform into insight, gratitude, and gentle wisdom. I now approach birthdays, moments of solitude, and days that once felt empty with a sense of openness, embracing them as opportunities to connect deeply with myself and others, to reflect, to give, and to receive care in its truest forms. And in this understanding, I have discovered the subtle, profound truth that even in the quietest moments, even in absence, life holds lessons, growth, and hope, reminding me that the heart, when nurtured with patience, awareness, and intention, can always find connection, fulfillment, and gentle joy, no matter where or how it unfolds.